Hey there, Patriots! Hope you're all doing well. I'm sure most of you has seen the Borderlands 4 trailer, and that is why I'm making this video. Though I'm sure the vast majority of you have already played a Borderlands game once or twice, or perhaps are a hardcore fan like me, but for those of you who might be interested in getting into a Borderlands game before the new one comes out, I got you covered in what game you should play first and why. And near the end of the video, I'll also give you a couple tips for all you new players. And if you have a tip or two you'd like to let the new players know also, make sure to comment down below. Also, I will only be talking about Borderlands 1, 2, and the pre-sequel since these three are going to be the main Borderlands games you'll want to play before you get into 3 or any other Borderlands game. Also, there will be no main story spoilers, so you don't have to worry about that here. So, let's talk about which Borderlands game should you play first. As a hardcore Borderlands player, you probably already know what exactly my answer is, and I have answers for why. As a new player, you might be tricked getting into Borderlands 3 or Tiny Tina's Wonderlands because these are newer games and go on sale regularly. But do not be deceived. Yes, these games might be new and look pretty to look at and play, but playing Borderlands 3 first, you'll be thrown into a story that, while it may have its own self-contained story, there are previous events and characters that have been in previous Borderlands games that you will feel disconnected from and won't know who the hell is who. And Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is a spin-off game, so don't worry about playing it. But, surprise surprise, your first Borderlands game you should play is the first Borderlands. And I have multiple reasons why. For one, this is where it all started. The Vault Hunters in the first game are also in the second game and the third one. There's massive bits of story context in the games further down the line that comes from playing the first game. Although I will say when it comes to like a narrative story type of thing, Borderlands 1 falls extremely short on that. So when you do play through Borderlands 1 and think to yourself that it doesn't really feel like there's much of a story, then you're not really alone on that. But it's the things that happen in the world of Borderlands is what matters the most, rather than the narrative being given to you. Farming gear and building out your character is not only just the main point of the game, it is also essential for late game when you want to go out and farm a raid boss. Borderlands 1, in my opinion, does a decent job at making gear farming a lot more accessible than 2, and helps you build out your character better than in 2 because of how simple the Vault Hunters are in Borderlands 1. One thing I noticed with Borderlands 1 is that the abilities that each Vault Hunter has feels more like a secondary piece of equipment rather than the main mechanic of that character, and their combat abilities take priority over their unique skills. The only character that I feel like they rely on their unique skill the most is Roland with his turret, whereas Lilith and Mordecai are more combat oriented with their skills, increasing their damage with weapons and so on. And I've honestly never played Brick, so Brick mains, let me know what you think about him. But going back to the skills part that I was talking about, what I mean by Borderlands 1 being more accessible for gear farming is that in Borderlands 1 there really isn't any enemy to my knowledge that drops a specific legendary. Every legendary is a world drop, so whether you fight a boss or farm loot chests, you're always going to be able to find that legendary you want as long as you farm for it. Even though Borderlands 1 only has one raid boss, Cromrax does an excellent job as a raid boss to teach you how challenging raid bosses are and how raid bosses work. When fighting Cromrax, there are purple hit points on his arms, his eyes, and his back, and those are his specific hit points you need to hit to deal damage to him. This teaches you that this is his specific mechanic in order to damage him. Now, to be honest, I abuse the fuck out of the ledge because fuck it, I don't really care to fight him fairly, and he can still be incredibly frustrating to fight because of how fast he moves, how much damage he does to you, and his stupid little crabs that chase you. Which, by the way, his little crab minions are weak to different elemental types. I actually really like this mechanic because it puts use of the elements in the game, and if properly equipped, you can get a self-revive by killing one of the crabs to keep you in the game. You don't have to fight him only using the ledge, but if you're a Mordecai player, you'll greatly appreciate it. After you've played through Borderlands 1 once or twice, you're now ready to move on to the next Borderlands game. but perhaps you might be confused on whether you should start next with Borderlands 2 or the pre-sequel, since the pre-sequel takes place just before Borderlands 1 and is setting up for the sequel, Borderlands 2. Now, if you only care about playing the games in absolute order and don't care about playing the better game, then by all means, play the pre-sequel first, then on to Borderlands 2. However though, I don't really recommend that, and I'm sure many of you Borderlands fans can agree to that too. What I mean, for one, the pre-sequel is substantially way more subpar than Borderlands 2, and I think Borderlands 2 does a way better job at getting you to like and dislike all of its newest characters, and I think you should play 2 first so you can get attached to the characters. Handsome Jack is easily one of the most iconic villains in all video games, and I think 2 does a much better job at getting you to like Jack as a villain. Whereas the pre-sequel takes you along with the story of Jack and lets you get to see his downfall when he becomes the person that he is in Borderlands 2. And other than just the story, Borderlands 2 has countless amounts of hours of replay time. Quite honestly, I think it's one of the most replayable Borderlands games out there. Just like Borderlands 1, there are 4 base Vault Hunters, but there are 2 DLC Vault Hunters that add so much more replayability, not including all of the main DLCs and the Headhunter DLCs on top of that too. Just like Borderlands 1, you will be doing a lot of farming, but unlike Borderlands 1 where most of the legendaries are world drops, Borderlands 2's largest portion of legendary gear is far from specific named enemies or bosses. And overall, Borderlands 2 is just a big game with so much to do, has an incredible story, fun gameplay loop, and so much more to keep you entertained for hundreds of hours. That's why Borderlands 2 should be the next game you play right after Borderlands 1. Then finally, if you haven't gotten burnt out of Borderlands stuff, then the pre-sequel should be your last Borderlands game you should play before you go on to play 3 or one of the other spin-off games. As I said before, the pre-sequel has a major drop-off in quality compared to the previous games, and that's because the pre-sequel kind of is and isn't a spin-off, if that makes sense. The pre-sequel isn't made by the main Gearbox studio, it was made by a smaller subsidiary of Gearbox in Australia, which is why if you've noticed that some of the characters in that game sound Australian. And since Gearbox Australia didn't have the budget or resources that the main Gearbox studio has, the game suffered pretty hard from it. It also doesn't help that Randy Pitchford made some questionable choices to the game too, like removing farming from the game entirely by not having bosses respawn. So the pre-sequel acts as more of a story game with the traditional Borderlands style of gameplay, and I would only really recommend playing it if you are really interested in the lore of Borderlands and want to see what led up to Jack's dive into insanity and how he took over Hyperion. So as I said in the beginning, I would give a few tips for some of you new players near the end of the video, and for any of you experienced Borderlands players, feel free to give some tips down below that you would want a new player to know what you did before you knew it. So, here we go. Tip number 1. Don't be afraid to try out multiple characters before fully committing to one. Borderlands 1 and 2 and even the pre-sequel all have their own unique characters with their own unique skills and abilities. And committing to one character to fully build them out can take quite a bit of playtime. So before you fully commit to a character, just load one up, look at their skills and see if it's something to your liking, and if not, move on to the next character and do so until you find what you like. Tip number 2, farm your gear. Something I notice a lot of new players do, especially ones that aren't too familiar with looter shooters, is that they'll play Borderlands as if it's a linear story game and all the loot drops are just given to you and what you get is what you get. Now you could get away with doing that on playthrough 1, but on a playthrough 2 you will definitely want to farm legendaries and arm yourself. Tip number 3, play however you want. Now I know that this tip might seem a bit contradictory to tip number 2, but with this one I mean by however you want to build your character. Whatever skill tree sounds the most fun to you, even if it's not the most optimized one, just go for it. Whether you want to go down one specific tree or balance out with multiple trees, go for it. Just be warned though that if you do something like that, your build may not come to full fruition till later on in the game. But the whole fun of Borderlands is experimenting what builds work for you and are the most fun to do. The only time I would maybe think about looking up guides if you're a bit newer is if you want to play Ultimate Vault Hunter mode but you still aren't entirely sure what you're doing. Then at that point I would recommend looking up some build guides because UVHM is extremely difficult. Even super experienced players can struggle with UVHM with how hard it can be. And the last and final tip I have for you is to just simply look around and explore the world of Borderlands. Just take a moment to stop and look around at the environment around you. While yes, Gearbox has their issues with every game they've made, the one thing Gearbox absolutely kills it with is with their environmental art and design. If you're one of those people that can't stand older games because of their graphics, then you're lucky because with Borderlands' unique art style, the game visually looks timeless. So, while you're playing Borderlands, just take a moment to stop and take a look around at the world around you.